to the Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. Later in the program, Congressman Kelly Armstrong is going to be joining me for his weekly segment, taking your questions. Remember, if you want to get questions in for both Congressman Armstrong and Senator Kramer, they're on the podcast every week. You can email them to rob@sayanythingblog.com or watch for the Facebook threads I put up every week. You can add your questions there as well. But before we get to Congressman Armstrong, I wanted to talk about a couple of things that happened in the legislature recently. First is you've probably, if you've been following my columns, the blog, this podcast, you know an issue that I've been talking about. It's called death by fiscal note. And essentially what it is, it's a situation where state agencies use the fiscal note, which is a report on a given piece of policy, whether it's introduced at the legislature or we also do them for initiated measures. It's an estimate of what that bill's impact is going to be on the state's finances, whether there's a cost or sometimes if the policy maybe raises a tax or something, there'll be some additional revenue, but basically it's an estimate. And what happens a lot of times is when a state agency has a desired outcome, what they'll do is they'll manipulate the fiscal note in order to try to achieve the policy outcome that they want. This came to a head. It's been happening for a while. I should point out, first of all, last legislative session, there was a bill to raise the state's speed limits, and the Department of Transportation came out and attached just a ridiculously large fiscal note to it, suggesting that we were going to have to make changes to all the state's highways and exit ramps and everything like that. They attached that to the bill, and the bill got defeated. That bill came up again this session, and in a moment, I'm going to play you some audio from lawmakers who got pretty upset at the fiscal note that was attached again this time around. But it's not just the Department of Transportation doing this. Back when the medical marijuana bill was put on the statewide ballot, the Department of Health, which I think maybe didn't want the measure to pass, attached a fiscal note to it that estimated implementing the bill was going to cost millions and millions of dollars. The actual cost, by the way, as of just recently, was about $800,000. So the fiscal note clearly inflated, clearly not an accurate representation of the true impact of that bill, and that's a problem. Now, in North Dakota, we take a lot of pride in having a part-time legislature, right? We have a citizen legislator. Our legislators are not full-time politicians. They don't get full-time pay. Most of them, if they're not retired, have day jobs that they leave in order to go down to Bismarck and govern. And so these lawmakers are very, very dependent on the executive branch to get accurate information about the issues that they're voting on, information like fiscal notes. And the reason why they have to is because these lawmakers, they don't have staff. In fact, they don't even have offices. If you've ever gone down to the legislature in Bismarck, the only people who have offices at the legislature are the caucus leaders for the Republicans and the Democrats, like the majority leader and the minority leader. They have offices. Nobody else has an office. They basically just have that desk on the floor that maybe you see sometimes in a television broadcast or something if they're showing video from the floor of the House of Representatives. All they have is that little desk on the floor. That's it. And the only research ability they have, sometimes legislative counsel can do some things for them, but their only real research ability that they have is research that they do for themselves. So they're very dependent on the executive branch to bring them information to inform the decisions that they're making. But if it gets to the point where the executive branch is manipulating that information in order to produce certain policy outcomes, well, we have a problem. Now, this, again, like I said, this came to a head this week. They were debating on the floor a bill to raise North Dakota's speed limits. The bill failed. Well, and when I say failed, it actually came out to a tie vote, which means it didn't pass. It has to have a majority. It was a 46-46 vote with two lawmakers absent. The issue may come back to the floor. I don't know yet, but not really important for the topic of this particular rant is the speed limit policy. I know a lot of different, I would be fine with raising the speed limit. You may feel differently. But to me, what was really interesting is on the floor debate, a couple of lawmakers just absolutely called out, ripped the executive branch for inaccurate fiscal notes. I'm going to play the audio for you. This is State Representative Rick Becker. He's a Republican from Bismarck. He's been on the podcast a couple of times. Here's what he had to say about the fiscal note attached to that bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. I support this bill. I'm going to vote green on it, but I'd like to talk very briefly about a different aspect of it, and that's the fiscal note. And I know we kind of joke around, and I've said it publicly before, and I think others have as well. These fiscal notes are causing some consternation amongst the legislators. And the concern I have is when fiscal notes are used as a form of lobbying to try and get the legislators to vote according to what the agency may see fit. And so I guess what I'd like to call attention to in this fiscal note, and there's so many we could address. Sometimes signs in a fiscal note cost a lot, sometimes they don't. I remember on transportation last session, we had a bill came through that they indicated how we need to raise our fees because every single license plate they print, they lose money on. And we had another bill that said they're going to have to print less license plates because we'd have people come through less frequently, and that was going to cost us money too. So there's such a inertia to maintain the status quo, and we citizen part-time legislators having to rely on full-time, year-round agencies, what we need to do is ask for a little more accountability. In this particular fiscal note, this is the first one for me. I've not seen a fiscal note here that wants to alert us and try to quantify the social costs. And it says on the second page of the fiscal note does not quantify the cost impact to society. Well, that's good. It's not supposed to. But then it does go on to do what it says it's not going to do. And it also tells us that this particular bill is totally contrary to the objective of the state of North Dakota's Vision Zero program. The Vision Zero program is not part of the bill. Therefore, I don't want to hear about it in the fiscal note. So I'm very respectfully trying to bring a little light. I'd like to ask for legislative management, the leadership of both caucuses in both chambers, to work with the governor, to work with the agency heads, to try and get a little bit more accuracy and consistency and integrity so that we don't feel like we're being bamboozled to vote a certain way because of our concern about the fiscal implications of the note. Thank you.
It's interesting that he actually calls it sort of lobbying by fiscal note, right? And he says that lawmakers feel like they're being bamboozled. Lawmakers feel like, there's not integrity in the information that they're getting. That's very important. Now, the other audio I have, this is from State Representative Ben Koppelman. He's a Republican from West Fargo. And he had some interesting things to say, comparing costs that were in North Dakota's fiscal note to costs in other states.
A few instances or things having to do with the fiscal note. We heard that the fiscal note was $4.8 million this biennium and $4.5 million every biennium after that in the foreseeable future, because they're going to make improvements to highways and actually design them for a speed higher than what we're currently driving. I don't know, I probably wasn't alive the last year that they were building interstates in the state of North Dakota for the first time, but I believe it was sometime in the 70s when that was completed. And in that time, they built the interstates for a much higher speed than people were driving at the time. And that has served us well as we've changed over the years. So logic would suggest that as speed limits increase, regardless of if this bill passes or not, that they would use dollars to improve the safety for higher speeds, anticipating that different types of technologies might happen and you might drive faster with different vehicles in the future. So that's something that they likely should do, and I sure hope they would do, whether this passes or not, and it's not really relevant to the fiscal note on this bill. In the state of South Dakota, who has roughly the same amount of miles of interstate as we do, it costs a grand total of $22,700 to implement 80 miles an hour. Our fiscal note, $4.8 million. I called their Department of Transportation, and are they taking some of the prudent steps as they rebuild interstate highways? Yes. Would they have designed their interstates with better safety and functionality for higher speeds, even if they hadn't gotten 80 miles an hour? Yes. Would they have used similar funds to our highway fund, which is not general fund dollars, and spent those anyway? Yes. So I would contend that out of the $4.8 million, we've got about $280,000 on the fiscal note that has to do with the change of this bill. Let's talk about that. North Dakota, apparently we pay at least double, if not sixfold, what our neighboring states do to replace a sign. I think we need to reconsider that. They're estimating that to replace one speed limit sign, not a post, just a sign, is $650. Our neighboring state of South Dakota spent $99.80 to replace that same sign. There's a problem. Our neighboring state to the west, Montana, spent an average of $245 a sign, which is still 2.5 times in South Dakota, but still about a third of us. So, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, if we're really worried about the fiscal note, I would be certainly willing on the other side to consider an amendment that would direct our Department of Transportation to bid South Dakota and Montana to find out if they could be our subcontractors and do our signage more affordably. But otherwise, I would ask for a green vote. And please, let's send a message that we don't approve of ridiculous fiscal notes and we do approve of good policy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Now, isn't that interesting? Representative Koppelman talking about how some of the estimates, I mean, we're talking about 6 times more. I mean, are signs 6 times more expensive in South Dakota or Montana than they are in North Dakota? It's a little hard to believe, and yet that's what the fiscal note seems to show. And also, they're lumping in a bunch of costs that really don't have anything to do with raising North Dakota's speed limit. I mean, if anything, these are costs that the Department of Transportation would probably incur anyway during the regular updating of our roads and our exit ramps and everything else. Not really something that's necessitated by this bill, and yet they're lumping these costs in. Why? Because, well, they just don't want the bill to pass. And that's a problem. Now, listen, I understand if the Department of Transportation thinks that a given bill's a bad bill or whatever, then I guess they should say that. I guess the director of the Department of Transportation or whoever it is should come down. Maybe the governor, since it's part of the executive branch, should come down and just express their concern about the bill. Just say, we think this is the wrong policy and these are the reasons why, and we can all have a debate about whether or not we think that their reasons are right or wrong. But to go and inflate costs, to go and say that something is going to cost something when it's really not, or to lump things together and be facetious and provide information that leaves lawmakers feeling like the information they're getting from their executive branch is ridiculous or lacks integrity, well, that's a problem. Listen, the whole point of this process is to create good policy, sound policy. And I'm not sure we can create sound policy if lawmakers, the people in charge of writing the laws, creating that policy, don't get good information. And clearly, they're not getting it from the executive branch, at least in some instances now. The other thing I wanted to talk about is HB 1530. Now, not so long ago, I had State Representative Craig Hedlund on to talk about this legislation. It's his bill. He introduced it. And what it would do is it would take legacy fund earnings and use those earnings to buy down and eventually eliminate the state income taxes, both personal and corporate. That bill came up to a vote this week in the State House, and it passed on a 61-31 vote, passed overwhelmingly, which I was actually surprised about. I was also surprised it had a strong recommendation coming out of the House Finance and Tax Committee. So that bill has passed the House. It'll go on to the Senate chamber where, honestly, I think it is going to be a tough sell, but we'll see what's happening. But what I wanted to address are some things that Democrats were saying about this bill now that it's passed. They sent out a press release indicating, their position on the bill, and they said a couple of things. First, this is from Representative Alicia Mitzcog. She is the ranking Democrat on the House Finance and Tax Committee, and she said this in the press release, I quote, "North Dakota continues to become more dependent on oil and gas revenues. Proposals like this will only make us even more dependent. North Dakota has the most volatile revenue of all states after Alaska. North Dakota also has some of the lowest personal or corporate income taxes in the country. We need a balanced tax policy in North Dakota that does not harm critical programs and does not put a financial burden on future generations." Now, she's not wrong. North Dakota does have extremely volatile revenues, and a lot of that is due to the fact that we have a commodity-driven economy. Most of our economy is agriculture, and most of the rest of it's energy. And what the problem is those are all based on crop prices, energy prices. If the price of oil tanks, if crop prices tank, and we saw both of those not so long ago, revenues in our state tank. And that's tough. And so I can understand we don't want to operate the state based on direct revenues from, say, oil taxes, which go into the legacy fund. We don't want to just balance our budget on oil taxes, because oil prices go up, oil prices go down, oil activity goes up, oil activity goes down. That could change a lot. So on the face, she's making sense. The problem is we're not really using oil tax revenues to replace the income tax. We're using legacy fund earnings, and that's a different thing. The legacy fund is funded by oil taxes. There's deposits made into the legacy fund every month. The balance of the legacy fund keeps growing. And as a matter of fact, under Representative Hedlund's bill, that balance will continue to grow because we're not using the principal of the legacy fund to fund this bill. Instead, we would be using the earnings from that principal. So it's all of that money, and it's whatever earnings that it produces from its various, like the ways it's invested or whatever else. Those revenues are what's being used to buy down the income tax and hopefully eventually eliminate it. And that's much more stable than oil and gas taxes. Not 100% stable. The stock market's not 100% stable. The sort of investments that the legacy fund will be invested in aren't necessarily 100% stable. But I would argue that they may be, they're more stable than oil and gas taxes by far, and they may even be more stable than income taxes, because don't forget that income taxes in North Dakota are impacted by our state's commodity-driven economy as well. Part of when oil prices went down, it wasn't just that the state of North Dakota lost revenues from direct oil and gas tax revenues. It's that we also lost revenues from the sales tax. We also lost revenues from the income taxes, because when oil activity went down, a lot of workers left the state, and a lot of commerce left the state, and those pushed down revenues from those other taxes as well. So to argue that this somehow makes us more dependent on oil tax revenues, I don't agree. This makes us dependent on, at least for income tax, replacing the income tax revenues, makes us dependent on revenues from the legacy fund. Now, the legacy fund will continue to grow. The legacy fund will continue to get deposits from the oil industry, and those deposits are going to go up and down depending on oil activity, but the principle is going to stick. The principle is there. And as long as we prudently manage the investments of the legacy fund, which, it should be a stable source of revenue. And hey, you know what? If everything crashes and we don't have legacy fund revenues anymore, we can always bring back the income tax. But in the here and now, if we're going to use the legacy fund to do something meaningful for our state, why not eliminate the income tax? The other response came from House Minority Leader Josh Poche. He's a Democrat from Fargo. And he wrote this, he is quoted as saying this in the press release. In 2008, the people of North Dakota soundly rejected a measure that would have reduced personal and corporate income taxes. But the legislature has chipped away at income taxes ever since. As a result, we've seen cuts after cuts in essential services. 10 years later, the legislature hasn't learned its lesson. We need to have a frank discussion on the direction we want to take tax policy in North Dakota. Income tax, property tax, and sales tax need to be balanced. Using the legacy fund to eliminate income taxes is not the answer. The voters enacted the legacy fund to provide for legacy projects, not to support a shell game that robs Peter to pay Paul. Now, a lot of this is nonsense. I think the voters did support the legacy fund to do something that has a legacy. I think not having an income tax as a state is a pretty darn good legacy. I mean, that's a meaningful thing. You want to talk about diversifying our economy? How about luring businesses to our state by saying, hey, we don't have a corporate income tax? That sounds like a pretty good thing to me. But this idea that the legislature's been chipping away at the income tax and that's caused, cuts to essential services. Listen, what's happened in recent budget cycles is, yes, we have seen a lot of cuts. But that's because spending exploded during the oil boom. Right? When we had all of that oil activity that was going on, that was driving not just oil and gas tax revenues, but was driving sales tax revenue, income tax revenue, corporate income tax revenue, all these different revenue streams, our lawmakers had a pile of money, and you know what? They spent all of it. And then what happened is oil prices fell back down to earth. Oil activity fell back down to earth. And you know what? Our budget had to fall back down to earth too. But here's reality. In 2009, 2011, our general fund budget for the state of North Dakota was about $3.2 billion, almost $3.3 billion. In the 2019-2021, the 2017-2019 biennium, the current biennium that we're living in right now, the general fund budget is $4.3 billion. That's about almost a 50% increase over where it was back in 2009, which was the first biennium after that 2008 measure that Representative Boucher alluded to. right? The income tax cuts that failed. That was the first biennium after that. So according to Representative Boucher, he's saying, we've seen cut after cut, and it's all because we've been cutting these income taxes. And you know what? Even though we saw a boom and then a bust in terms of state spending, and we've seen all these cuts the last two biennia, our state budget in 2017-2019 is still nearly 50% higher than it was 4 biennia ago. It just doesn't jibe with reality. So this idea that we can't eliminate the income tax, that it's this terrible idea that it's going to make us dependent on oil tax revenue, none of it makes sense. All right, that's it for the rants today. Congressman Armstrong, straight ahead. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Congressman Kelly Armstrong joins me now, as he will pretty much every week, schedule allowing, for I guess open podcast segment. I don't know. Basically what we're doing is we're soliciting questions from you, the audience, every week, or really anytime. You can email the questions to me, rob@sayanythingblog.com, usually the day of when I'm going to interview Kelly. I solicit questions from social media, so look for those posts on my Facebook or on my Twitter if you're following me there. And then I'll ask the questions of the congressman when he's on, and you can listen to all of his answers. And again, you can email these in anytime at rob@sayanythingblog.com. Kelly, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I wish I'd have known they were on Facebook. I could have went and read them in advance.
Yeah, well, maybe next time. You you actually told me just before we started recording, you said you spent 8 hours yesterday on universal background checks on committee. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. It's the Democrats control the committee. The bill came in. At the end of the day, the bill was going to come out of the committee exactly how it came in. That was just preordained, and it was going to be. But we offered a lot of amendments. None of them were taken into consideration by the majority. But I think the overall tenor of the conversation that concerned me the most was in this quest to prohibit people who aren't supposed to have firearms. One, I don't think the bill does anything to actually accomplish that. But more importantly, we sure seem to forget about the constitutional right to bear arms for law-abiding citizens, at least on one side of the aisle. Particularly concerning outside of the whole bill being bad was the exemptions for hunting and fishing. There were no exemptions for farming and ranching, but generally speaking, they write exemptions in order to pretend like they are doing something to protect these things, but the exceptions are written so narrowly that it's impossible to actually implement them.
Well, that's really sort of the problem with this stuff, is I feel like endlessly in the gun control debate, we keep having these horrific crimes committed, and we keep looking for a public policy solution to them, but the practical realities of the policy, if we want to strike the appropriate balance between gun rights and public safety, it's not that easy, and it's not that complicated. And I'm not sure in most of the times, I know it's good politics to demand policy changes after an ugly incident, but I don't know that really there's a lot more we can do policy wise.
Well, I mean, there is that pesky little Second Amendment, which I'm pretty proud to support. But I think even more importantly, and this is where the politics of this really come into play, the Obama administration wrote a white paper on this issue, and they said that expanding background checks will have no effect without a national registry. And there is no national registry in this bill. And so, I mean, a cynic would say they are doing this purely for political purposes, all the while making people who want to follow the law, like just about every single gun owner in North Dakota, making it harder for them to exercise their constitutional right.
I wanted to get into the questions now. Right after Jamie sent this in, actually right after our first interview last week, and he said he was sorry that he missed the interview, but he wanted to ask this question. He says, there's something with Kelly that I've been curious about, but we're not personal friends, so I haven't been able to ask him. His entire political career has been spent being in a supermajority, and part of it as leader of his party at the same time. In D.C., he is now a House freshman in the minority, which is as close to powerless as one can be while in elected office. I'm really curious about what the transition has been like and if he finds it a struggle to accomplish something that was relatively much easier before. He can certainly have a big impact on individual people using his office's constituent services aspect, but he likely can have extremely little or no impact on legislation.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I think big policy things that I think will benefit North Dakotans are probably not going to move through the U.S. House of Representatives under Democratic control. That is absolutely true. But I have a varied background. My first job as a grown-up was coaching American Legion baseball, and after that, I was a criminal defense attorney for 10 years. And I will tell you, being a criminal defense attorney prepared me way more for being in the minority than any of my roles in state government or party politics. And what I mean by that is, to be effective as a criminal defense attorney, you argue an awful lot on primarily constitutional rights, and you just understand you're going to lose a lot. And so you continue to make those arguments. You continue to advocate for the things that are important, in this case, North Dakota and the constituents there, knowing full well that you are probably not going to win at the end of the day. But we're also setting the table for arguments that will be coming in the future when we do take back the majority. And there's always time to make sure you're educating people on things that are important.
We'll go to Facebook now and ask some of the questions there. Don asks, with all of the attention given to 3 new Democrat representatives, do you feel that you're flying under the radar? Let's see. He says NGD has many projected negative, costly impacts on the new Green Deal. Excuse me. The Green New Deal, I think that's what he's talking about, has many projected negative, costly impacts on agriculture and are coming from people with below average knowledge of the ag industry. What do you see coming in terms of legislation, and how can you help the sponsors understand realities?
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that question. And yeah, I mean, I think I'm torn on it. I mean, there's definitely celebrity members of Congress. There are celebrity members of Congress in the freshman class. I will tell you, I think just about every single media interview I have done in North Dakota has asked me about AOC. And half of me is like, listen, there, even on the other side, people I disagree with, there are serious people that have where you're supposed to have serious debates. I don't particularly think the Green New Deal is one, but at the same time, I will continue to talk about it as much as possible because how little likelihood I have of it succeed. I see it succeeding because it economically just doesn't pencil out. It just will not. It does not work in our society. I want to continue to talk about it because I want people to understand what the opposition and the far left in this country truly believes, because it is absolutely detrimental to North Dakota's way of life.
Dustin asks, he goes, do the Democrats' new faces have any idea what they're actually doing, or are they completely lost in a haze of power?
Both. There are, like I said before in the previous answer, first of all, there's 31 Democrats that won in the last election cycle in Trump districts. So there are some more moderate and even ones who aren't necessarily moderate, reasonable, as I said before, that you can have high-level policy conversations with and potentially work out some compromises. And those Democrats are smart enough to know they need 60 votes in the Senate to pass anything as well. So they're willing to sit at a table and work through those things. But I would go with the celebrity candidates are much more interested in celebrity than governing.
Do you see that a lot in politics? And I felt this way for a while. And to me, it's not just the celebrity politician, those high profile people we see all the time, because they're always posting provocative things on social media, or they're constantly on cable news or what have you. But to me, it's also groups. Like, I get the idea that a lot of these political groups, right and left, frankly, not all of them, but a lot of them, I sometimes get the feeling that they're just there to fight. They don't really want to solve anything. They want to fight. They want to fire up their donor bases and just make more money. Do you see that as well?
Oh, you can even go to, you can also go to cable news and all of those things. You're not getting a lot of reasoned debate is something we should do more of, not less. Celebrating bipartisan achievements. The First Step Back last Congress, the opioid legislation last Congress are 2 examples, and we don't do a very good job of that. more people want to watch or more people want to click on people yelling at each other. And you're right. That's how particular groups raise their money. That's how particular groups continue to drive traffic to their websites or their social media pages. And I think we have to get back to, there's a lot of bipartisan work and different groups coming together to solve things that actually does go on down here. We just don't ever talk about it because apparently it's not newsworthy.
Connie asks, what does he think of the Cruz proposal to take drug money to pay for the wall? And I think that's Ted Cruz's, for people who haven't been following this, it's El Chapo, which I'm sure you've all seen in the headlines or in the news. Basically, he amassed a lot of wealth. I think actually billions of dollars worth of wealth. And Senator Cruz has proposed, taking some of that money and using it to build the border wall. So that's what Connie's referring to. She asks, what are his thoughts on measures needed to stop? Well, she asked for that first. Let's start with that. What do you think of Senator Cruz's proposal?
I think it's a fantastic proposal. Anything that it doesn't matter if it's the border wall or anything else. Any way we could do this without raising the deficit, I'm all in favor of it. I think more importantly, when we are seizing those types of assets as part of a criminal conviction, we should utilize them for the things that can slow down that happening in the future, whether it's building the border wall, whether it's investing more in addiction treatment. I mean, any of those types of things. I think the argument has merit. I have to be honest, I haven't read the bill.
Are you concerned at all about what that could mean? I mean, I feel like this is one of those things, and yesterday we were talking with Senator Kramer about this, and he's actually a co-sponsor of the bill. And, I like that, but something I didn't bring up with him, but I got to thinking of after the show was, are we setting a precedent whereby we're going to do this in other instances? Because I think it kind of, like in this moment, this makes sense, where it's like, okay, well, we're going to seize these funds, we're going to use it for this. But then are we going to do that where, like, I worry about setting a precedent where we're going to start seizing funds and then using it for, I worry about what comes next. You do this once, when do you do it again?
Well, policing for profit is not a good public policy situation, and I agree with that. At the federal level, how we do federal civil asset forfeiture is, I think, incredibly problematic in a lot of incidences. But I think anytime you do something like this, you have to worry about what happens next. That being said, I'm not sure multi-billion-dollar cartel seizures come all that often. I wish they came more. But yeah, you always have to be concerned about that, especially when you're talking about seizures and especially when you're talking about the potential for abuse in policing for profit.
Now let's switch gears a little bit with President Trump. There's the conference committee of which your colleague, our Senator John Hoeven, is serving on. They've come up with a deal, and yesterday, Senator Kramer seemed a little lukewarm on the bill or on the proposal. He says he hasn't actually seen the text of it. President Trump, frankly, seems a little lukewarm on it. What are you thinking out of what you've seen of this deal that's been struck? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think I told you before we went on this that I have the pages and sitting on my desk, and I'm going to spend the afternoon going through it. It's more than just a border wall. That's what gets all the headlines, but this is a continuing appropriation. I think going through it and figuring out what's in there, I know there's tremendous amount of things that are important in North Dakota with the farm programs and just rural economy issues that are in the bill. But at the same time, we're in a divided government, and we're going to have to make these determinations on a lot of these things that, like I said, you're going to get Democratic support in the House and Republican support in the Senate, and you just have to make a decision as to if there's enough good in it to outweigh the bad, because I can guarantee you there's nobody in this town that likes everything that's in this bill.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a truism. I think people say, a good compromise is when everybody walks away feeling a little bit unhappy. But in this situation, I feel like Congress has been here before, where, public consternation about illegal immigration and about border security ramps up. We cut some sort of a deal, and it tides, it goes away for a while, only to see it come back again. I feel like we've done compromise after compromise. At some point, do you feel the need to make sure that this is something that has a little bit more permanence?
Yeah, but I mean, we're talking about Homeland Security, ag and rural development, commerce, justice. I mean, I think financial services in here, the interior, the environment. I mean, that's the problem. There's one particular piece of this that has caused, and rightfully so, by the way, a lot of consternation since the government actually shut down. But there are also a whole bunch of other essential government features that are in here. I particularly am going to be looking to see how much new spending got added into this bill. We just passed 22 trillion, and I'm sure there is some there. So I'm not saying that's an absolute, deadlock to this. Again, going to being in a divided Congress and making sure that we can keep some of our essential agencies funded. But I have a pretty good handle on what's in there regarding the border. My question now is, what else is in there that we need to be cognizant, careful of?
Yeah, what do you think about President Trump? I mean, he's been talking about using executive powers, and again, that was something not to everything that we talk about in the context of Senator Kramer, but that was something he said yesterday. Is he's really interested in hearing some specifics from what President Trump thinks he can do in terms of using executive powers at the border. Do you feel the same way? I mean, how do you feel about the president using his executive powers in that way?
Well, this kind of goes back to what we just said about El Chapo. In this particular instance, I think it probably is warranted, but I'm really lukewarm on the idea. And it's just, these are the kind of decisions that when they get made, aren't made with one Congress and one president. Once the genie comes out of this bottle, this is an area where I think we really, really have to take a careful look and make sure that it not only is not being abused this time, but won't be abused by other people from other parties or our own party in the future.
Well, Kelly, that's all I got for today. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
That's it for today's Plain Talk. Remember, you can review the show if you like, if you're into that sort of thing. If the platform that you're listening to this on allows reviews, particularly iTunes, that's kind of an important thing for podcasts. You want a lot of reviews and ratings and things on iTunes. So anyway, if you see the option to do that, if you would give me a fair rating and give Plain Talk a fair review, I would sure appreciate that. By the way, if you're not listening to this on a podcasting service, try it out. Pocket Casts, that's the one that I use. Spotify, there's all sorts of them out there. Just download one, search for Plain Talk with Rob Port. You should be able to find it. If for some reason you can't find it, or if you got some feedback on the show, you want to send in a question for one of the guests, whatever, email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com. You can even just drop me a line and say hi, because I like it when people say hi. Follow me on social media at Rob Port on Twitter. You can track me down on Facebook. Just search for Rob Port. Say Anything Blog is on Twitter and Facebook as well. Pretty easy to find. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again.